Welcome to Short Course, episode 132 for July 12th, 2024. I'm your host, Ben Barry. We had a board meeting on Monday. It was, I believe this one set a record. It went for 5 3/4 of an hour, 15 minutes, 20 minutes short of a 6-hour board meeting. So for here on the East Coast, it started at 7 p.m. and went until 1:45 in the morning. I think part of that is just we need to start putting more of a hard cap on certain agenda items, especially with an estimated duration. I think Heeman said before we started that the list of topics was estimated to take 4.5 hours as is. And obviously that was off by a factor of approximately a third. So I actually ended up having to drop towards the end once we were on the last agenda item, and I'll talk to about that when we got to it. But the meeting did have a number of time-sensitive issues that it is a good thing that we got to them. There were, in retrospect, a few things that could have waited 2 weeks until the next meeting. But I did want to dive into some of them, the biggest one being the reviewed 2023 financial statement, which by the time you're hearing this is public. So it'll be posted with the minutes on Friday, the same day that this podcast drops. So you can go read along, look at it yourself, and try and follow what I'm trying to say and what I'm talking about. We did start with a vote to live stream, which passed 7-2, so just barely making the 3/4 majority needed. And the flip side of that is most of this meeting, once again, didn't end up being an executive session because it basically revolved around either contracts that are ongoing, potential future contracts, or employment-related matters. And so I think of those 6 hours, at most maybe 2 were in open session. Now, I'm glad the stuff that could be was, and hopefully folks watched and kept an ear out for when there was open session content. But yeah, this is just the nature of live streaming. Is not everything can be live streamed, but we are doing as much as we can. The first agenda item, which again, in retrospect, we probably should have punted to a later meeting because it won't take effect for, I think, until next January, was a review of the new peak stage times for Steel Challenge. So basically this is every stage in Steel Challenge is effectively a classifier. And one of the interesting facets of that is every year at the World Speed Shooting Championship, they run all 8 stages, and they're guaranteed to be set up correctly by the folks running that match. They're guaranteed to be RO'd as close to correct as is possible, right? It's not a club match where someone might shoot a miss, but the RO doesn't catch it, that kind of thing. You're going to be catching misses as much as possible. And so every year after WSSC, they take the data from the actual match scores shot on the bays on those days and use that to look at where the peak stage times need to be adjusted. And there are a number of divisions that are actually getting pretty substantial adjustments. I think the only ones that aren't that are only getting 1 or 2 stages adjusted are limited and open. Some of the other holster divisions, like I think single stack and production, are getting some changes, but a lot of the low ready divisions, the 22 rimfire and the PCC divisions are seeing quite a bit of change, which just reflects the fact that the sport is getting faster. But I thought that it was an interesting aspect that we are able to get as close to reliable data by running basically all 8 classifiers at effectively nationals every year. So not something that's really sustainable or scalable to USPSA, where the stage design and philosophy is very different. But I thought it was an interesting example of, actually, having really high quality data makes this analysis actually fairly straightforward. So that, like I said, probably wasn't the most urgent thing, but this was the first meeting at which the data was ready after World Speed Shoot happened. So we went over it first thing in the meeting before I think we started to understand how much things were stretching out. And we did end up kicking out a whole bunch of other business items off the agenda that were on the agenda that we didn't even get to in those 6 hours. One of them being the 4 proposed bylaw changes that the bylaws committee had put forward. But as soon as we were done with that, we went into an executive session with a representative from our independent accounting firm to go over the financial review for 2023 that they had prepared by looking at all of our books and all of our statements, and just sort of talking through what's in there, answering questions before coming out of that executive session to vote to approve and accept that review. So that'll be posted, like I said, at the time you're hearing this, it'll be on uspsa.org/BOD_minutes, I think. It'll be up with the board minutes, as well as uspsa.org/finances. So you can pull that. It'll show the 2023 numbers, because again, this is for the period ending December 31st, 2023. And as is the typical format, it's shown compared to the 2022 numbers. So 2022 was an audit year. So basically in an audit, we pay the accounting firm more and they spend more time, ask more questions. In a review, it's a lighter level of scrutiny, but we still have to send them the statements and they have to make sure everything adds up. And I want to deep dive on this a little bit because I think it is definitely one of the more significant things to come out of the board recently, especially in light of all the emphasis that I and everyone else are putting on financial transparency. So having this review gives us a picture of basically what the trajectory of USPSA was from January to December of last year. So this was under the board at the time, under the managing director at the time. So I don't know how it feels to you guys out there, but to me that feels like 10 years ago, but it wasn't all that long ago. So, before all the protests kicked off, all of that. And I will say, as a disclaimer, I'm not an accountant. I don't have a background in corporate finance, nonprofit finance. I know how to balance a household budget and read spreadsheets and look at numbers and see how they add up. But in the meeting with our accountant, as well as, with the rest of the board members, I basically put forward the interpretation that I'm about to go over and asked, is there anything I'm missing? Is this not a correct interpretation of the data for any reason? And nobody could really point to anything I had wrong. So if once you, the membership, get a chance to look at the financial statements, hear what I'm talking about and look through this lens, if you see something that I get wrong, by all means, reach out to me, send me an email, let me know, and I will do an update to this, because the reason I'm saying this is my best understanding, and I want to pass that understanding along to the membership. And so if my understanding can be enhanced, I want it to be, and I want to share that. So that's the standard disclaimer. Now, the question that I had going into looking at this review, as I have past reviews, these financial statements, is basically how much did we spend versus how much did we take in a given year? And this is complicated by a few things. One is obviously the way that USPSA does long-term memberships, so 3-year, 5-year, and lifetime memberships. So lifetime memberships are amortized. I don't know if that's quite the right term, but they're spread out over a 20-year period. So under the old system where at the old price of $500 for a lifetime membership, we would recognize that member as paying $25 a year for 20 years. So, and under the old membership dues, that was the same as an associate member. And so on pages like the first actual page with tables and numbers in the financial review, the statement of financial position, that page refers to that money as basically, it's just cash in our accounts. It's not as far as I know, in any kind of segregated account that it has access restrictions to it. We just don't recognize that as revenue when we're looking at operating expenses and operating income. But on that first page of statement of financial position, that money all shows up as basically being there in that year. And so that's why you'll see a fairly substantial jump in how much we have in our accounts last year, because there was approximately 500,000, maybe a little more, in revenue from lifetime memberships being sold after the membership dues was announced, but before it went into effect. So I think that first page, the statement of financial position, is useful to get a sense of what are our actual assets, how much do we have in the bank, what are our reserves. But the question that I posed earlier of how much did we bring in terms of recognized revenue, not actual cash that cleared our account, but in terms of if we're looking at a lifetime membership as being recognized $25 a year, how much of that how much did we bring in 2023 and how much did we spend? And so I think the second page of numbers and tables, the statement of activities, is actually much closer to answering that question. It just has one thing that really muddies the water, which is the investment return line, where in each year, the unrealized gain or loss in the value of our investment accounts is treated as income, effectively. And so, again, from the way I look at it, the way I understand these numbers, the best way to get a sense of what we actually spent versus what we actually recognized as revenue, what we brought in, is to take the change in net assets from operations and subtract the investment return line. So basically, what was the change in our net assets, which net assets just means assets. What do we have that's worth money minus what did we spend that cost us money? Again, not an accountant, not a professional definition, but that's from the reading I've been doing and the talking I've been doing, that is my understanding. And to put this into perspective, if we apply this methodology of taking change in net assets from operations and subtract investment returns. So basically, well, let's take 2022 as an example. 2022 in this financial review looks like an unmitigated bloodbath. It shows a change in net assets of $619,000, which looks like we spent $619,000 more than we brought in that year. But if you reduce that number by the investment return, which in this case was a $263,000 loss, then the actual amount that we spent more than we brought in, more than the recognized revenue in 2022, was $350,000, $356 to be exact. Now, that is still a horrible number, but it's about half as bad as that $619,000 number looks. So if you cut that the other way, in this statement of activities page, under change in net assets for 2023, we had a negative 141,000 change in net assets. So basically we lost 141,000. But that was with $153,000 investment return. So basically, if our investment accounts are just taken out of this, then we would have lost an additional 153,000. In fact, that's what we did. We spent that 153,000 is recognized as income, but we haven't sold any assets. We haven't actually cashed out any of our assets, but because they have increased in value, it's shown as income on our statement of activities. But if we actually look at what we spent versus what we brought in, it doesn't count. And so if you basically add those two numbers up, the 141,000 and the 153,000, we, according to this, as best I can tell, last year, USPSA spent $294,000 more than it brought in recognized revenue. So that's still $300,000, a net overspend of $300,000. Now, that's $56,000, $60,000 less of an overspend than the year before, but it's still completely ridiculously unsustainable. Now, USPSA has about $3 million in assets. So if we were to continue trending negatively at the rate of $300,000 a year, we would basically spend up our whole nest egg in 10 years. But that means we have 10 years to turn the ship around, and I don't think it's going to take 10 years. So again, this is all just a picture of what happened in the previous 2 years under a board that's mostly not present and a managing director that's no longer present. But it's also a very clear picture of how big the hole is that we have to dig ourselves out of in terms of what we are. Most of these expenses are recurring. It's not like there was, a single $300,000 Lamborghini that was bought. If we just don't buy the Lambo this year, we make up that difference. It's a lot of little things where all this money is going, but establishing financial controls, tracking where it's going, actually making the budget that where we expect to make a profit and then sticking to it and following it. That's all still on track. Our budget did show a small surplus at the end of the year. We did not write a budget that predicts us losing $300,000 more than we take in a further year, even with the protests and everything else being down in terms of activity. So this is a a very sobering wake up. It's not 2023 doesn't look as bad. It wasn't a $600,000 loss, but also, 2022 was not a $600,000 loss, but also 2023 kind of looks worse than it does because that $150K investment gain in value helps to make it look like we didn't overspend as much as we did. Now, one thing I think that is interesting is going back and applying this methodology retroactively, looking back over the past few years. It is very interesting to me to see how much things have changed. So the point that I made around the time that the membership dues were being increased last year, where the price of a regular annual membership went from $40 a year to $65, so a jump of more than half. The argument that was being floated at the time was, well, we haven't kept up with inflation and we haven't raised dues in 20 some odd years, whatever the number was. And that might be factually true, but it obscures the fact that we have not been steadily losing money with inflation slowly creeping up. It's not like our losses were creeping up commensurate with inflation, where each year we were losing 4 or 5% more than we were the year before, depending on what inflation was that year. If we go back and look at 2019, which was sort of the high watermark before COVID, shut a bunch of clubs down, made components almost impossible to get. 2019 was the high watermark of activity and membership up until recently. And in that year, applying the same approach of taking change in net assets and subtracting the investment return line, in 2019, USPSA as an organization had a surplus of $100,000. Now, 2020 put a crimp on that, but it was still $33,000. And it wasn't until 2021 that we flipped over to the negative and we overspent income by $43,000. Again, applying this change in net assets and subtracting the investment return. So things turned around very rapidly. I mean, USPSA was profitable even in 2020, even with activity down, even with component prices being high. USPSA was profitable 3 years ago without having to raise member dues from 40 to 65. And that's kind of logical because as long as the membership is growing faster or keeping pace with inflation. So if we bring in 5 or 10% more members a year, then it's enough that the additional income, keeping the price we charge each member the same, but increasing the number of members being charged, it's actually possible to keep up with inflation, assuming most member services don't have a substantial marginal cost. Now, every magazine we send out that does have a physical marginal cost, but that's covered by the portion of the membership that pays for it. The portion of your $40, now $65 that helps to pay for that. But again, even at 2020 mailing rates, we were not losing our shirt on the magazine. And so to me, the whole reference to it's been 20 years since we raised membership dues is comparing to the wrong number. It's that in 2020, we still managed to be profitable at a $40 annual membership. And so I still think the raising the membership dues the way it was done was wrong. I think we need to have a discussion about what we can do to address that and make membership more affordable for members going forward. But that's just Ben's opinion. There have been no formal discussions about that yet. So I will leave that there. But that's the best answer I can give you as you read the financial statement. That's my take on it of how to look at that. And from a very high level, say, what did we spend? What did we take in? I think you look at change in net assets from operations and you subtract investment return, and that gives you the closest picture to what did we actually spend and what did we actually make last year, according to the schedule that we recognize these things on. The next section of the meeting, the next agenda item, was around appointing the match director for the 2 remaining USPSA Nationals for the year, the Open PCC Nationals and Handgun Nationals, which will be happening this fall in September and October. And this was related to the fact that Carry Optics Nationals happened. By all reports, it was a great match. Feedback has been very positive. Maybe there are folks out there that are disgruntled about it. I haven't heard it, but obviously if you had issues, by all means, reach out to me. I want to get a well-rounded picture of how things went. But by all reports, match director Todd Holmes and his crew, right? It's not one guy, but it's everybody involved with picking stages, setup, logistics, Mr. Fix-It, quartermaster. I mean, it takes a village to put on a match like this, but under the direction of Todd Holmes as match director, it was a very high quality match. And so based on that, the president, Yimin Lin, whose responsibility it is to either serve as or appoint a match director, was appointing Todd Holmes to be the match director for the 2 subsequent nationals as well. And there was some discussion about the fact that there will be some compensation for the 2 further matches in addition to the compensation that we voted to approve at the previous meeting, which, as it happened, was a few days before setup, or I think it was during setup for Optics Nationals. So the discussion, I think, it mixed up 2 issues, which was, one, the fact that we were blindsided as a board with the need to authorize the expense for this compensation basically at the very last minute that it possibly could have waited. And the fact that we were looking at approving a similar expenditure for 2 more nationals to hopefully get 2 more well-run matches for the membership. And I pointed out during this meeting that the fact that we were talking about approving Todd as the match director for 2 more matches was completely irrespective of any action or issues that needed to happen as a result of the way that Todd was appointed for the first match, and that any actions taken in that vein would be an employment matter because the president is an employee and is entitled to confidentiality about issues related to his employment. And so the fact that nobody was speaking up to berate Yimin about this particular topic was not a sign of us just saying that's water under the bridge. We've forgotten all about it. Let's just move on to the next thing. It was the fact that that discussion needed to happen in executive session. And in fact, it was on the agenda and happened in executive session later in the meeting. So I want to be very clear that the fact that we need to separate process from outcome. The fact that Todd Holmes was very successful as Nationals match director and put on a great match is separate from the process through which, through no fault of his own, the board was not alerted to the deal that we were on the hook for in terms of compensating him for that work. So the outcome was good, the process was bad, and we're focusing on replicating more good outcome with better process. And that's really all I can say at this point. But the fact that that was definitely the most spicy part of the live stream, it was just, I said it once and I didn't see the point in repeating it over again, that we have to separate employment matters from open session boardroom nationals matters. And then once we moved on from there, we went into a series of executive sessions about 3 different topics. One was around having a discussion and hearing the status of the planning for 2025 nationals, which obviously we need that's confidential because per the bylaws, there's no contract signed. And so we can't start talking dates or locations until we actually know that we have a contract with the ink dry. So that had to be an executive session. We then had we're following the process where each executive session has a specific process. So it might seem a little contrived to vote to leave and vote to come back in, but at least in the minutes, you can see how long each executive session on each topic is lasting. So the second one was related to extending an offer to a managing director candidate, which we went into the executive session, talked about it, came out, voted unanimously. So all 9 of us had a chance to talk to this candidate, and we all felt that he is the best candidate from the diverse pool of candidates that we were able to gather, both from within the sport and through working through a recruiting agency. So of all the resumes that came in through either mechanism and looking at kind of the flow of how many resumes we were continuing to get versus what we had seen before, we all thought, yep, this is the guy. So it was a unanimous 9-0 vote to extend an offer. If he chooses to accept, we'll be putting out a statement with more details coming, but I really hope he does. And I hope that you are as excited to see what he's able to do for USPSA as we are, because I do get a really good sense that he will be good for the organization. And that was how far we got by around 11:15 when I ended up having to drop off the meeting as we went into the next executive session to discuss the compensation committee report, which per the public charter, the compensation committee is in charge of reviewing the performance and compensation of all the employees that report to the board, which includes the managing director, the president, and the DNROI. And so that executive session lasted over an hour. I think they came out around 12:30, and at that point voted to act on a few measures to restrict the ability of and the latitude of the president to continue to travel. So basically blocking further funding of any discretionary expenses and denying any further non-bylaws mandated travel, with the understanding that basically those are measures that are allowed per the policy, but the board can also change that policy with a vote, and we did. Now, I wasn't there for those votes, but I support what was done. I have to be very careful with what I say because the president is both an elected position, so the membership needs to have the ability to make an informed decision about who to elect. But at the same time, the president is an employee and has all the protections that an employee has regarding their confidential employment status and ongoing details. So, yeah, all I will say is this is a discussion the board has been having. This is something that is a part of the ongoing work of the compensation committee to review the performance and compensation of the employees that report to the board. And I was not there for those votes, but I was aware of what was happening, and I support what was done. And hopefully this can be a place to move forward from, and that these measures and resolutions voted on by the board will not have to be permanent, but can be relaxed once different outcomes are seen. But we will see. That's the point of taking these votes and taking some steps and letting you, the membership, see that we are taking these concerns seriously and acting on them, but in a measured and deliberate way. So again, without saying too much more, we are listening, we are watching, we appreciate the feedback. And please understand, there's, like I talked about in the previous episode, there's stuff going on behind the scenes that isn't quite yet public, but this is quite a bit of it. This meeting, a lot of these things are coming to fruition, and we are sort of progressively moving down the line, addressing issues one at a time. So we will continue doing it, and hopefully as time goes on, and especially if we can bring on the new managing director and get him in the chair and up to speed, then I think we really are at a spot to start turning things around and set ourselves up for 2025 to be a new dawn for USPSA, the start of a new era. Well, that wraps up this episode of Short Course. If you want to get in touch with me, my email is ben@berryshooting.com. Talk to you next time.